Right on. Okay, so we're wrapping up our Fearless series today, and I'm sure for some of you, you're like, thank goodness, like we're done with this series. We're moving on to something fun with cool purple lions, right? Again, many of us, that's good news that we're leaving this series because we've been talking about money and finances and those kinds of things. And I get it. Talking about finances, it's not the easiest, most fun thing to talk about. Like we're kind of getting into the start of tax season, and it's like, I don't know if you have, you call up your accountant or your CPA, and it's like, hey, let's just hang out. Right? You don't. Like, we just like, listen, let's just get this over with, right? Let's just get through this. Let's get to the other side of this. Because money and finances, it feels personal. It brings out all kinds of feelings and thoughts and emotions, most of which in us are pretty strong. We typically don't have these like light, breezy, carefree, and fun conversations about our finances. And the reason that that's probably true for a lot of us isn't because of money. It's actually because money is the object that gets tied to and connected to the unhealthy and distorted fears that hijack and take control of our hearts, minds, and souls by force, and they end up running our lives. Our lives they end up being run by fear. See, money tends to be both the object of many of our fears and what we look to, turn to, and trust to relieve those fears. So money becomes both the cause and what we hope is the cure for what we fear the most. Like, just think, how many times have you thought, man, if I just had more money, I wouldn't have to worry as much. If we could just make more money, then most of, if not all of our problems would be solved, right? I know that I've thought that. I mean, those have been thoughts and those have been conversations, and man, if we just could make this much, if we just had this, then these problems would go. If we could just do this, then we could figure this. If we could just do this, then all of our dreams would come true. See, money becomes this thing that we think, we believe will fix our marriages. Like in a recent study that I read, nearly 25% of couples who were surveyed, their marriages ended in divorce. They stated that money and finances were at the center of that conflict and were the leading causes in them deciding to end their marriage. That's 1 in 4. 1 in 4 couples that were surveyed, their marriage ended because of money and finances and disagreements and tension and arguments and angst and anger tied to finances. Money, it's what we believe and we trust in to bring us things like happiness or peace or satisfaction. It becomes what we chase after to find or establish purpose and meaning. It becomes the remedy to our worries. And that's why when you find yourself in the heat of an intense conversation about your finances, the reality is all of those emotions and those feelings that get kind of spun up and worked up inside of us, it's usually not about money at all. It's usually about something much, much deeper and much more important than whatever that bottom line in our balance or our checking account looks like. Usually it's about more than what we think, our finances, our income should be, isn't, would be, or could be if we could just get our hands on more of this. One of the things we've been saying a lot throughout this series is for Jesus and for us, this is not a finance issue. It's a freedom issue. And I think it's important before you kind of start, clenching your fists, right? Before you get angry, hear this. Jesus doesn't talk about money because he wants it or needs it from you. Right? Jesus doesn't want your money. He doesn't need your money. Jesus talks about money because of what he desires and wants for you and for us. And he makes that really clear. What he wants for us is a life of abundance. A life that's maxed out when it comes to freedom and not one that's trapped in fear. But at the same time, Jesus was the smartest person to ever live, right? He knew then that money was and still is his greatest competition for the throne of our hearts, minds, and souls. That's why he talked about money so much. If you read through the Gospels, one of the things that you notice, Jesus preached and he taught on money. He used money as kind of like an object lesson, right? More than anything else. He taught on money more than he taught on anything else. And one of the things we say a lot here at Adventure is Bible people are just people, right? They're like us. And like us, people in Jesus' day, they directed and they aimed their lives at money just like we do. People in Jesus' day, like us, they spent their resources, they leveraged things like their time and their energy and their attention trying to get more money. Money's what got their time. It's what they used their energy. They spent their energy trying to get more of. It was the thing that captivated their attention. They paid the most attention to money. And just like us, they put their hope in money, and they expected it to do the kinds of things for them that really only God can do. And so that being the case, here's what Jesus knew. Jesus knew he could talk about one thing, money, and use that to bring freedom to everything that kind of works within us, that gets connected to the distorted and unhealthy fear that invades our lives, that confines our lives, that holds our hearts, minds, and souls captive. I mean, nobody is smarter than Jesus, right? Jesus was smart, he was wise, he was clever, so he knew I could talk about money and actually talk about all of these things that go to work in our hearts, minds, and souls to hold us captive in fear. I've been quoting a guy named John Tyson, who's a pastor in New York City. He said it like this. He said that financial generosity and discipleship is all about liberating the heart from the curse of selfishness and idolatry. And I think that word curse, right, is fitting. Because the idolatry, what that means, that means we idolize something. We go and we worship whatever that is. The way we kind of make that make sense, it's whatever is ultimate in your life, whatever you kind of turn to, look to, hope for, and expect to provide for you, to take care of you, that tends to be what we make ultimate. That becomes an idol. If it's anything other than God, it's an idol. It's ultimate. Selfishness is just making ourselves ultimate. And it's a curse. Why? Because we look to these things, ourselves included. We look to those idols and expect them to do for us what only God can do. And if you've ever done that, you know it's a curse. Why? Because the level of disappointment, the level of chaos and hurt and betrayal that happens in our lives when those things we expect to do the things that God can do actually end up showing us, hey, we never could. They made promises they never intended to keep. And something that I think is a good reminder for us as we wrap this up is, as we talk about money, I just need you to know this is not a fundraising project for the church. It's a mission led by Jesus to liberate our hearts, minds, and souls. And something we've mentioned over the last few weeks is this: money is a great servant, but it's a cruel master. Meaning, you can make money work for you, or you can allow money to make you work for it. It's something that you can make work for you, but it's also really easy to slip into that trap of being made to work for it. And this is kind of the beauty of Jesus using money to get at all the fears in our hearts, minds, and souls. As much as money can be used by fear to hold us captive, it can also be used by God to bring us freedom. It works both ways. But in order for it to bring us freedom, we have to be willing to use money in the ways that God points us to through stewardship and generosity, and in doing so, not allow money to rule us. Because the truth is this: in the Bible, fear and its effect on our lives is almost always compared to slavery or imprisonment or captivity, because the opposite of slavery, imprisonment, and captivity is freedom. Catch this, right? Gaining more courage and bravery in this series, right? That's not the goal. The goal in this is not for you to go like, gosh, I just need to be more brave. I need to white knuckle this and try harder to be more courageous. That's not the goal. The goal is to live in freedom. That's the end goal in this. Living in freedom from fear, that's the goal. Courage and bravery, when they get applied to things like our finances, that's actually what helps us get to the goal. Freedom is the destination. Courageous generosity and radically brave stewardship are what pave the path to get us there. And again, that's the brilliance of Jesus. It's not try harder, do better, be more perfect, perform. It is train. Train to become someone who lives in freedom. Train to become someone who lives their life like this. Well, how do we do that? Through generosity and stewardship. Through generosity and stewardship, courage and bravery actually get made stronger within us, and that leads us to freedom. And we've circled back to this truth every single week. Freed people don't simply try harder to be fearless. They leverage their freedom in Christ to train, like I said, in stewardship and tithing and offering to become people who fear less. Less fear equals more freedom. That's what we're after. And to me, this again, it's just another example of Jesus' brilliance. Jesus, he actually teaches us how to use money as a practical tool for training in courage and bravery so that we can live in the blessing of freedom that's found in discipleship with him. And that's just beautiful. That Jesus can take something tangible like money and use that to allow us to become stronger, to train in courage and bravery. Why? So we can live in freedom. That's what this is all about. And if you have a hard time believing that, if you're like, yeah, Brad, like you're a pastor, like you kind of have to say this, right? No, right? Here's what God says, right? God says this, Malachi 3, starting in verse 10, he says, test me in this. In what? God says, test me when it comes to using and dealing with money in the ways that he lines out. I mean, God lines out things like stewardship, where we are owners of nothing and stewards of everything. We are caretakers of the resources that God has entrusted to us. They're God's. He owns them. They belong to him. He entrusts them to us. Generosity, looking for opportunity to give, to be generous people. Tithing, right? Giving 10% of our income, returning 10% of what God has given us to him to fund and fuel the expansion of the gospel, offering, giving beyond that to help the needs of others. Those are the things that God says, look, like this is what it looks like to handle and deal with money through the ways that he lines out. He says, test me in this. And see if I will not throw open the floodgates of heaven and pour out so much blessing that there will not be room enough to store it. See, by giving and sharing of our resources or generosity that belong to God, that have been entrusted to us by him, stewardship, to care for the people that he loves, we actually reflect the truth of who God is to all creation. And we create more space in our lives to receive the blessings that he promises to provide. I mean, that is beauty across the board. The way that God could take something so tangible, so kind of earthbound, and use it to create space for eternity to grow within us. I think that's a beautiful thing. So what I want to do today as we wrap things up is kind of with the time we've got left is I kind of want to meet us where we are in all of this. See, whatever you decide to do with your finances after this series is over, it's really between you and Jesus to work this out together. It's not between you and me. You don't have to answer to me or our staff or our elders. It's between you and Jesus. The reality is this, you know what's at stake. You know what's at risk, and you know what God promises. And so the ball is in our court. We can decide what we want to do with this. And so my hope as we wrap things up today is that we would just kind of get in the same room with Jesus for a minute to allow him to meet us where we are. And so we're going to read one of these stories that Jesus used to tell. They're called parables, right? He would tell stories about things that we can understand to point us to this kind of cosmic truth that might be harder for us to wrap our brains around. So if you got your Bible or your Bible app out in front of you, Matthew 13 is where we're going to live today. So go ahead and flip Matthew 13, first book in the New Testament, Matthew, Mark, Luke, John, Matthew chapter 13. Again, here's the story that Jesus tells. He says, a sower went out to sow. Sower is sowing seed, like a farmer, right? Scattering seed on the ground. And as he sowed, some seeds fell along the path, and the birds came and devoured them. Other seeds, he says, fell on rocky ground where they didn't have much soil, and immediately they sprang up, but since they had no depth of soil, when the sun rose, they were scorched. Since they had no root, he says, they were withered away. He says, other seeds, they fell among the thorns, and the thorns grew up and choked them out. He says, other seeds fell on good soil, and it produced grain, some 100-fold, 60, some 30. And then Jesus says, he who has ears, let him hear. Which I love the way Jesus would just kind of end stories with, if you could hear this, understand it. It's kind of a mic drop moment. Telling the story about seeds and sowing seeds and different kind of soils and rocks and birds and thorns. He who has ears to understand this, hear it. There's a ton to unpack here. So again, a parable is a story that Jesus would use. He would point to things like seeds and soils and farming and thorns and rocks and all that kind of stuff. He would point to those things that's easy for us to see so that we can begin to understand some truth in his heart that may be harder for us to wrap our brains around. So for us to get on the same page here, when Jesus talks about the soils, he's not just talking about dirt. What he's talking about is the environment or the conditions that exist within our hearts, minds, and souls. He's not talking about soil conditions, right? He's actually talking about us. And so just like if you and I were to go out and sow real seeds and expect them to grow, if you've ever done that, right, you know that the condition and the environment in that soil is a major factor in determining whether or not the seed will grow or not. And you kind of see where this is headed. So the soil is us, right? That's the condition within our hearts, minds, and souls. The seed is what Jesus calls the word of the kingdom, also known as the gospel. Well, what's the gospel? The gospel is this proclamation, right? It's a declaration. It is the story of Jesus' life, death, and resurrection. It's the story of God's love for us that really opens the door to a new reality. There is a new way of life that it's possible through Jesus. It's this proclamation and declaration. You don't have to live the way that you used to live or maybe are living now. There is a new way to live. There is a new reality, and Jesus makes it possible. But living in that new way involves you and I surrendering every aspect of our lives, including our finances, how we spend our money, what we expect from money, the role that money plays in our lives. That has to be surrendered. Here's why. The gospel doesn't save or redeem or repurpose parts of our lives. It saves, redeems, and repurposes all of it, including our finances. Jesus didn't, again, his point, his life, death, and resurrection, God's love for us isn't just to save certain parts of our lives. It's to save all of it, to repurpose all of it. Our lives can begin to tell a new story. I don't know where the story of your life has been. I don't know how you would classify the genre of the story of your life, but what I can tell you is through Jesus, you can start a new chapter, and the beginning of that new chapter can say, from now on. And Jesus is who makes that possible. But it requires surrendering everything that's come before, everything that is now, in order to step into this from now on new life that Jesus makes possible. Now, something that's really critical to notice here is this, right? The seed doesn't change. The sower isn't trying to choose the right seed for the right kind of soil. The sower is not trying to match a type of seed with a type of soil. And what that means for us is this: the gospel never changes. The gospel is always the same. The only thing that does change is the type of soil, right? The soil, that thing that represents the condition of our hearts, minds, and souls. And it's that determines the result of what the seed, the gospel, does or does not do. Whether the seed grows, whether the seed is safe, or whether it is left exposed and vulnerable to threats. That has everything to do with us and the condition of our hearts, minds, and souls. In other words, as you think about your life now, if you go like, I don't think there's really anything growing in my life, it's not a seed problem. If there's nothing growing in your life, it's not a sower problem. It's a soil problem. And I say that because me too, right? Sometimes when we look at our lives, we kind of take an inventory of our lives, it's easy to put our fingers in God's chest and blame him. Like, you're not doing what needs to be done. God, if you would just, but it's not him. He's not the issue. We are. Check out verse 18. Jesus explains this. He says, "Hear then the parable of the sower. He says, when anyone hears the word of the kingdom, the gospel, and does not understand it," right? And that's not a question of comprehension, right? It doesn't mean like, oh, I don't understand it. That's not a knowledge thing. It's taking it in. When he talks about understanding, it's allowing that to sink into who we are. He says, when someone hears this word and resists understanding it, you're not allowing it in. Do not, like, I'm pushing back against it. He says the evil one comes and snatches away what's been sown in his heart. This, Jesus says, is what was sown along the path. So the first soil type, the path, kind of represents closed off hearts, closed off minds, closed off souls. We are not receptive to the truth of Jesus or the gospel at all. It's not that we can't understand it. It's not a head knowledge thing. It's that we push back against it. I don't want this. And maybe over the last few weeks, or maybe even this morning, if you've come to this series, maybe you found yourself taking this kind of posture, right? Arms crossed. As soon as I mentioned the word money, your thoughts sounded something like this: I don't need Jesus to run my finances. I'll run my finances myself, because I think I can probably run them better than Jesus. Jesus has no idea what it's like to try to live in 2026, right? Maybe you've been in a place like that, like, whoa, Jesus. You're talking about money. Jesus, stay in your lane. Jesus, you handle all the spiritual stuff in my life. I'll handle all the money stuff. Deal? Again, the gospel does not want to save parts of your life. It wants to save all of your life. That's not a deal that Jesus will make. Jesus doesn't want some of us. He wants all of us. So I got to say, if anything like that's crossed your mind, it's a pretty good indicator that the condition in your heart, mind, and soul is kind of like the soil on the path. But here's what we need to pay attention to. The threat, Jesus says, is the evil one, Satan. The result, according to Jesus, is that Satan snatches and devours what's been sown into our hearts. Why? Because our hearts resisted, pushed back against it. The gospel never grows roots, never bears fruit in our lives or anyone else's. You may not know this, but Satan is very aware of the gospel. The Bible tells us that Satan and even the demons, they believe in Jesus. They're aware of Jesus. They know who he is. They push back and resist against him. Satan is aware of the power of the gospel. He knows what the gospel does for us. He knows about the freedom that it brings. Satan knows what the gospel would mean for our lives if our hearts, minds, and souls would take it in and allow it to grow in us. He's aware of that, which is why he resists it so much, and why he wants to snatch it and steal it away before it can grow roots in our lives. He knows what would happen in our lives and the lives of others if we took on a gospel view of money and lived in the kind of freedom that God offers, and we offered that kind of freedom to everyone around us. And so get this, Satan doesn't want your money either. He doesn't want it. He's not interested in your money. He's interested in your heart, mind, and soul. And so he wants to keep you in this hard-hearted place, this closed-minded place, this place where spiritually you keep stiff-arming Jesus out of your life. Satan does not want to see you freed of fear. He wants to feed fear. And he'll use something like money as a tool to do that in our lives. But this is what I need you to hear, right? If you remain hard-hearted, right? If you remain closed-minded, if you're spiritually resisting Jesus, the threat to your life is not financial, it's spiritual, which means it's not a temporary threat, it's an eternal one. That's a big deal. That's why Jesus says this in Mark 8. He says, for whoever would try to save their own life will lose it. But whoever loses or surrenders our whole lives for the sake of the gospel, we allow the gospel to come in and take over all of who we are, will actually save it. He says, what does it profit a man to gain the whole world but forfeit his soul? So let me say this. If money is leading you to believe that you can save your own soul, or maybe that your soul doesn't need to be saved, or that you can make enough money that you don't need God in your life, you can handle it, or that money is your money and you can do whatever you want to do with your money to serve you in whatever way you want to be served, can I just say this? There is no greater danger than the one you're facing right now. The result in trying to gain the whole world outside of Jesus is that it will cost you your soul and your eternity. I read a story this week about a guy on a plane, and he said he was sitting on the plane, the plane was at the gate, and it was supposed to have departed, right? The door was supposed to be closed. They were running about 10 minutes late. He was kind of figuring out, like, I got to get to my connection. I'm going to miss my connection, my next spot. And they came on. They said, listen, we are waiting for a passenger who was getting off another flight for whatever airline this was, and this passenger just crossed the 2 million mile mark. A 2 million mile travel. They had traveled 2 million miles on this particular airlines over a period of time. And so, they could hear this person kind of walking down. Everybody's on the plane. We're just waiting on one person, the 2 million mile guy. He's making us all late. And they could hear him kind of coming down the gate, and like all the flight attendants and the captain came out and met him and shook his hand as he came on. And they celebrate this person, and he gets to his seat, and he sits down next to this guy that's writing this article, and he's being celebrated. And the guy next to him said, "Man, 2 million miles. I mean, air travel is really expensive. Like, what did that cost you?" And the guy who was being celebrated, who looked really sad, when he answered that question, "What did that cost you?" He said, "Everything. I've been traveling. I've given my everything to my business. I've given everything to my work. Yes, I've been able to travel 2 million miles. Yes, I get all the first class tickets, and I get the access to the clubs or whatever in the airports. And yes, I live in a nice house. And yes, I make a ton of money. But here's what it cost me. It cost me everything. It cost me my marriage. It cost me my kids. I have no relationship with my kids. It cost me everything. 2 million mile traveler. I'm celebrated by an airline, but no one else. You know who doesn't care that I traveled 2 million miles? My ex-wife and my kids who I don't speak to. This is what Jesus gets at. That's what the threat is. It's not financial, it's spiritual. It's not temporary, it's eternal. You can gain the whole world but lose everything. Let's go back to the soils, verse 20. Jesus says, "For what was sown on rocky ground, this is the one who hears the word and immediately receives it with joy, yet has no root in himself, but endures for a while. And when tribulation or persecution arises on account of the gospel, immediately he falls away." So this is the rocky soil. And what this means is there are boulders of junk right below the surface in our lives that prevent the possibility of real growth. The threat, according to Jesus, is persecution and tribulation on account of the word. AKA, there's a real tension in our hearts, minds, and souls between living in the ways of Jesus, where what we believe is based on what he says is right, true, and best for our lives. There's a tension between that and then living in the ways of the world. There's this tug of war between Jesus and culture. And so maybe at the beginning of this series, maybe you were thinking like, okay, you know what? It's the beginning of the year. It's time to make a change. New year, new me. Let's do things different. You were open to the idea of potentially starting a budget or tracking your finances or maybe even starting to tithe. But here we are about 5 weeks later, and everything today is exactly the same as it was on the first Sunday in January, which is the same as it was all of last year, and the year before that, and the year before that, and the year before that, and the year before that. Nothing changed. What happened? Well, I just got busy. You found yourself under persecution from your calendar, and before you know it, all of that initial excitement you had about learning a new way to handle your finances gets scorched and it's dead and gone before any kind of real lasting change can take hold in your life. And we think, well, I really wanted to change. I really decided this was going to be the year that I did things different. I just couldn't find the time to sit down and really work on it. Can I just share a truth with you, something that I've learned when it comes to investing our resources to bring about change in how we live? Time isn't found, it's made. Time is never found, it always has to be made. If you wait until you find the time to make changes in your life, you will wait forever. You have to make time. By blaming your calendar, you're allowing yourself to become the victim of fear. And if you stay there, let me just tell you, life will just keep happening to you. By taking some responsibility to make and invest time in your life to learn and live in the ways of Jesus, you actually start happening to your life instead of life happening to you. That's the beauty of the freedom we find in Christ. It's not a calendar problem. The reality is you've got boulders beneath the surface of your life. There are other hidden fears below the surface that get activated by the fear of changing your life or changing how you deal with money and the fear of what might happen if I actually change. Like, what might happen to me if I make a change here? What will other people think about me? What will happen to my calendar? What will happen to my priorities? What will I have to begin to say no to? What will I have to begin to say yes to? And that fear begins to take over and we stay stuck. And I know we're all busy, me too. And so when we say, yeah, I just couldn't find the time, what we expect from people is, yeah, I know. It's an easy out. That we know people will forgive us, right? We know we'll find mercy when we say, I just got too busy. Because everybody's busy. You're not going to make time, right? You're not going to find time. You're going to have to make it. And for some of us, maybe it's not the calendar. Maybe the tribulation comes from the tension you felt between what Jesus has to say about training and stewardship and tithing and the values and priorities of the world that like killed off any kind of courageous generosity before it could grow roots. Like Brad, people will think I'm crazy if I give 10% of my income away to the church. Like, what will people think? What will people think if I can't uphold the right kind of image in my friend group or in the community or in the office? What kind of reputation will I have if I begin to give money away? How can I prove that I'm successful if I don't have the resources I need to look successful? This is what I mean, and this is what happens when I say that the things that we think we own actually end up owning us. We don't realize what it really and truly does to our lives when the time and space that we set aside to build our connection to Jesus, our connection to the church, our connection to community, our belief in the gospel, when that becomes the first thing on the chopping block, we can't begin to imagine the effect that it has on our lives. But yet, that's what happens. At the first sign of trouble or pressure, when things feel chaotic, the truth of Jesus is usually the first thing that gets tossed out of our lives. Finances start to get tight. What's the first thing that gets cut? Tithing. Well, we got to stop that. I know what it says in the Bible about tithing and God's blessing, but this is just too hard. I know that we were going to sit down and we were going to hammer out a budget, but things are just too crazy right now. We'll figure that out at some point when life settles down, when things get easier. We'll circle back to that at some point. How many of us have said that? We'll circle back. Like when things settle down, when things get less chaotic, when there's less pressure, less stress, less worry, then we'll talk about it. Me too. How's that working out for you? You're not going to find the time. You're going to have to make the time. And I've said this before in a previous series, but when it comes to our fear of perception, what people think about you is none of your business. And there is freedom in that. Who cares? What people think about me is none of my business. Jesus goes on in verse 22. He says, as for what was sown among the thorns, this is the one who hears the word, but the cares, the anxiety of the world, and the deceitfulness of riches choke out the gospel, and it proves unfruitful. It's a barren life that does not yield what it ought to. And I think this one applies to a lot of us. I know it does for me. Like the seed of the gospel actually wants to take root in my life and even begins to grow in my heart, mind, and soul, even begins to grow in my life. But before the gospel can bear fruit, the roots of the gospel get intertwined and strangled and choked out by the other things that get planted in my heart, mind, and soul, the things that I allowed to grow there. See, this is the difference between the thorns and the boulders. See, the thorns have been allowed to grow. The boulders, like those are hidden. Those are hidden fears that get triggered and unlocked by other fears. The thorns actually come from what we've allowed someone or something to sow into us. We've allowed it, either passively or actively, intentionally or unintentionally. We've allowed someone or something to sow these thorns into us. And this is even more clear now why Jesus says we can't serve both God and money. The roots get intertwined. We start to have the same expectations of money that we would have of God. We expect money to provide the same kind of salvation and life that God provides. The threat is the anxiety that comes from the delusion of wealth. We feel and we experience the stress and disappointment and lack of satisfaction due to the fact that money can't and never will, never could keep the promises that God can. The result is the blessings of God get choked out by our own fear. And our lives become spiritually and financially barren. We keep all the resources for ourselves. And as a result, we receive no blessings from God, and we pass on nothing to bless others. Like Jesus says, our lives do not yield what they're meant to yield. And at the end of the day, our lives, they exist without the blessings of joy and peace and satisfaction and purpose that Jesus wants, that he provides, that he offers to us. That doesn't just affect you. It affects everyone connected to you. So that brings us to the fourth soil, Matthew 13, verse 23. Jesus says, for what was sown on good soil, this is the one who hears the word and understands it. Again, understand, not a head knowledge, not comprehension. You take it in. You allow it to work in and through your whole life. He says, he indeed bears fruit and yields, in one case, 100-fold, in another 60, and another 30. Here's one more reason I love Jesus, right? He kind of sneaks in one more like big truth in this story that's already full of really big truths. I read an article that said in Jesus' day, like the typical yields during the harvest time would range from 5-fold to 15-fold. So 5 times you yield, like you harvest, 5 times or 15 times, somewhere between those two, between what you sowed, right? Like really, they would say like a good return, a really good, like you say, I had a great harvest this year, was 10-fold. Like a 10-fold harvest is a good harvest. So here's this kind of little truth that Jesus kind of sneaks in here at the end. The fruit of the gospel will look different in each one of our lives, especially when it comes to our finances, right? This is not a prosperity gospel thing. This is not a way to get rich off of Jesus. That doesn't mean like we're all going to start driving the same kind of Mercedes-Benz. And when people pass by our church, it's like, check them out, right? That's not what that means. But catch what this does mean. Based on the harvest standards of Jesus' day, again, 5-fold to 15-fold, with 10-fold being awesome, when there are favorable conditions for the gospel to grow in our hearts, minds, and souls, the fruit it bears goes way above and beyond what we can imagine, 30, 60, or 100 times. The minimum, Jesus says, of what the gospel will produce in us is double what the maximum would have been considered in his day. Jesus said, like, the least you can expect is double anything that goes beyond your imagination. That's what you can expect from the gospel. And according to Jesus, all of that fruit is good, which means it is life that works the way it's supposed to. So here's how I want to wrap things up. I need us all to do this, right? Flip over to Galatians chapter 5. Galatians chapter 5, kind of further back in the New Testament. This is a letter that a guy named Paul, who was a preacher and church planter, that he wrote to a group of people living in kind of a region of the world called Galatia. And here's what he says. We're going to read this together, right? So I want us to read this together, and then I'll explain a couple of things, and then I've got a cool story I'm going to share, and then we'll close things out. But here, let's read this. So let's throw it up on the screen. It should be up there. Let's read this together, okay? Out loud, read it with me. For freedom, Christ has set us free. Stand firm, therefore, and do not submit again to a yoke of slavery. We're going to read it again together here in just a minute, but here I want to explain what this is. Just leave this up here, right? So when you see this word for freedom, again, if you got your app or you're taking notes, just highlight and circle that word. That word is a Greek word that means this: to liberate from that which would keep someone from salvation. It's to be set free from what would keep you from being saved by Jesus. But the interesting thing about that word freedom is that it is present and future tense. Meaning it points to now and going forward. It is from now on. But here's the deal. It's freedom from Jesus directed towards others. It's freedom from those who have been saved by Jesus, directed towards others, offered, given to other people. Then Paul says, Christ has set us free. Again, circle, highlight this word, free. This means this: to be set in, to exist in liberty. That's past and present. So one kind of starts now and goes forward and is offered to others. Free actually is now and going backward and is offered to us, those who are in Christ. And he says this: stand firm, persevere, keep going. Therefore, because you're free. Anytime you see therefore in Scripture, you have to ask, what's the therefore? Right? So really what he says in this moment is, because you've been set free to free others, don't submit. Don't become trapped again to a yoke, to bondage of slavery, fear. Don't dip back into fear. So let's read it one more time, and then I'll unpack it for us, right? Galatians 5:1, let's read it. For freedom, Christ has set us free. Stand firm, therefore, and do not submit again to a yoke of slavery. Here's what this means. You and I have been liberated and now have the liberty to be liberators of those held in captivity by fear. So Paul says, keep going. Don't give up. Don't dip back into and get trapped in this bondage of fear. If we want to put it really simply, it's this: freed people are freed to free people. If you have been set free in Christ, it's not just for you. It's for you to share with others. We've heard this saying, and it's a popular saying, right? People use it like hurt people, hurt people. The same can also be true. Freed people, free people. You've been set free to set others free. And I love this. I told this story kind of at the beginning of this series. Like, there's a cool moment in Luke where we see that actually Jesus' ministry was funded by a handful of women. That Luke tells us each one of them was freed of. One of them was freed from a demonic spirit. One of them was freed from illness. One of them was healed, right? They were set free. And so what did they do with their freedom? They invested their freedom in Jesus and his disciples, and they funded Jesus' ministry. Jesus' ministry set a lot of people free. For the last 2,000 years, it's been setting people free. In the same way, we are set free to free others. We are set free to set captives free. And if you're wondering, well, am I free? Check out what Jesus says in John 8. He says, if the Son sets you free, you are free indeed. And I love that word indeed because it means this: it is certain. It is a fact. It cannot be disputed. No one can say, I don't think you're free. When the King of the world, the King of the universe, the King of kings, the Lord of lords says you're free, you're free. When he says he set you free, you're free. And no one can dispute that. So here's the story I want to end with. Two guys that I'm sure were a riot at parties, a guy named William Tyndale and a guy named Humphrey Monmouth, right? If you've heard of Monmouth and Tyndale, just raise your hand. A few of us, okay. If you were not in the ministry team huddle and you've heard, okay, there we go. That's what I thought. So William Tyndale, if you don't know who he is, he was the first person to translate the Latin Bible into common English. And his dream was for everyone in England to have a Bible of their own. And this was considered to be heresy by the Church of England and by the Catholic Church and by the Pope. And to do this, to translate the Bible from Latin into common language was something that was punishable by death. So William Tyndale, that was his dream. His dream was for everyone in England to have a Bible of their own. And the Pope and the Catholic Church and the Church of England and the King of England said, this is a crime punishable by death. This is heresy. Humphrey Monmouth was an English businessman. He was a cloth merchant. Like, he was in imports and exports of cloth, right? It's the Art Vandelay of like the 1500s, if you're a Seinfeld fan. Import-export, right? He was a businessman, and so he meets William Tyndale and says, listen, I'll be your patron. I'll fund this. Humphrey Monmouth used his own resources to pay for and fund and finance Tyndale's work in translating the Latin Bible into English. Tyndale lived in Monmouth's house. He ate his food. Humphrey Monmouth arranged and financed and paid for all of his travel. Henry Monmouth and this kind of network of Old English sailors created this network of people to smuggle these English Bibles, out of Germany, out of Belgium, where Tyndale was working, into England. They would hide them in hiding places, in crates on their ships, and they would bring these English Bibles into England and distribute them among the people. He cared for Tyndale. He financed Tyndale. He leveraged his resources. Monmouth leveraged the resources. He knew, these are not mine. These belong to God. God gave these to me. He's entrusted me with this. I'm going to use what's God's to advance God's kingdom. And there was a risk and there was a cost to all of this. Tyndale was betrayed by people close to him and was executed. He was hung and then burned. His last prayer, as they sentenced him to be guilty, you're guilty of this charge, this is heresy, we're going to hang you and set you on fire. His prayer was, God, open the eyes of the King of England. Last words, and then they dropped him. Monmouth spent 18 months in an English prison, not fed, not given clothes, he was cold, he suffered, he was ill. But 2 years after he was released, 2 years after Tyndale's death, the King of England, who Tyndale prayed for just before he was executed, ordered that every parish throughout England should receive a copy of the English Bible. 6 million English people now had access to something they had never had before. 75 years after Tyndale's death, the King of England, new king, who was named James, authorized the very first official version of the English Bible, which we now know as the King James Version. The King James Version used over 90% of Tyndale's translation. Over the next 450 years, the King James Version held sway as the primary English Bible in families and schools and churches. History and language and culture have all been shaped by this book. You can find excerpts from the King James Version in George Washington's addresses, in Abraham Lincoln's speeches, in Charles Spurgeon's preaching, in Billy Graham's sermons, in Winston Churchill's speeches, and in Martin Luther King's I Have a Dream speech. Tyndale Publishing today is a publishing house. It is the leading publisher and distributor of Bibles in the world. But none of that would have happened if not for Humphrey Monmouth, letting stewardship and generosity go to battle with the real fear and real risk that had captivated and hijacked the hearts and souls and minds of so many other people, because no one would no one would sanction, no one would finance Tyndale's work except for Monmouth. In fact, Monmouth, as they kind of signed this contract, Monmouth signed it, they say he wrote in the air, Humphrey Monmouth, patron of one. He was the only one. But Monmouth knew he was set free to set others free. So my question is this: who can we set free? Who in our lives is waiting for someone like us to leverage our freedom for their freedom, to leverage our generosity in their lives so that they may set others free? You have no idea the William Tyndales that may be in your life. That you, through your sacrifice and generosity, can partner together with Jesus to advance his kingdom. This article, this book that I read, it's called Gospel Patrons. It doesn't look like a super fun book on the cover, but it really is. It's really cool. I would encourage you to read it. When Monmouth, it said Monmouth received the newspaper that day that Tyndale was executed. And as he read, saw that this friend that he had invested most of his fortune in had been killed. Monmouth, who was left with not much after spending 18 months in prison and giving the majority of his finances to fund this work, it said that what Monmouth read, or when he read that his friend had been executed, he whispered, "William, we did it." Who can we whisper into their lives, or even hear the voice of God, the Spirit of God, whisper into our lives? We did it. Because we were willing to be courageously generous and radically brave in our stewardship. We're getting ready to take communion. And again, what I would remind us in this moment is communion is an opportunity for us to take these kind of tangible elements that represent the freedom that Jesus brings into our lives. He sets us free from sin and death. And if the King sets you free, you are free indeed. It is certain. It is indisputable. It is a fact. And so my challenge to us this morning is, as we take this communion, that we don't look at it as a cup of juice and a cracker, a piece of bread, that we would look at this as these are the things that set us free so we can be free to set others free. My challenge is, in this moment, as you thank Jesus for your own freedom, you begin to ask his Spirit to give you the name or the face or someone that you know needs to be set free. Who is that person in your life that is waiting for someone to bring the freedom of Christ to their doorstep? How beautiful are the feet of those who bring good news. thank Jesus for the freedom that we have. But ask the Spirit to move us into the lives of those that need to be set free. And this time, if you need prayer, our prayer team is in the back. They would love to pray for you. I'll be down front if you'd like prayer. If you want to spend some time at the cross, just having a conversation with Jesus, you can do that. Or you can just sit right where you are and do that. Jesus meets you where you are as you are. And this time, if you want to join our church, again, I'd love to have that conversation with you down front. If you want to accept Jesus, if you've never invited Jesus into your life, I would love to chat with you about what that looks like. But again, we can have that conversation after service at the discovery table, or you can talk with our prayer team or any of our staff about that. But I want to pray for us, and then we're going to take communion and worship together.